everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar entitled What Works for Women Engaged in the Criminal Justice System. The webinar has been sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Presentation today, there are question and answer session. To question, please type your question into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We will do this to answer your questions, but please understand that this is a very large webinar, so your question may not get answered. If your question does not get answered during the webinar, I encourage you to post your question to the Consensus Project Forum, an online community that facilitates interaction with your colleagues and peers from across the country. You will find a link to the forum provided in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. There will also be a link to that website at the end of the presentation on a resource slide. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Again, that's 1-866-229-3239. Please note that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this, we are recording this event, and we'll be posting the recording to our website within a few days. Today, presenters are Rachelle Ramirez and Dr. Krista Gehring. Rachelle is a program associate with the Center for Effective Public Policy. In capacity, she supports the work of projects on a number of topics, including evidence-based decision-making, gender-informed practice, offender recovery, collaboration, sex offender management, and policy and practice assessment. She offers expertise in research, writing, and editing, project coordination and management, group facilitation, and project and curriculum development. Ramirez received her master's degree in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Maryland and received a bachelor's degree in sociology from McDaniel College. She has been with the center since 2005. Gehring is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Houston-Downton. She received her PhD from the University of Cincinnati. Her primary research interests include women offenders, gender-responsive policies, practices and programs, criminological theory, correctional rehabilitation, and risk needs assessment and classification. We are very excited to have Rachelle and Dr. Gehring as our presenters today. I now turn the line over to Rachelle.
Thank you. Afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you're calling from. As Cynthia said, I'm a program associate with the Center for Effective Public Policy, which is an organization based in Silver Spring, Maryland. Along with a number of partners, my organization received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance in 2010 to administer the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women. The National Institute of Corrections also partners with the Bureau of Justice Assistance to support the activities of the Resource Center. I just want to take a few minutes today and tell a little bit about the Resource Center and its services. Our mission is to provide guidance and support to criminal justice professionals who work with justice-involved women, and its services are targeted specific to criminal justice practitioners, state and local government agencies, service providers, and other stakeholders who take part in this work. The Resource Center's board of partners include a number of key individual and organizations that have been at the forefront of conducting research and developing evidence-based and gender-informed tools in the area of women offenders. They include the National Institute of Corrections, CORE Associates, Orbis Partners, the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, the Moss Group, Dr. Pat Van Boris and Ashley Bowman from the University of Cincinnati, and the Women's Prison Association. The Resource Center is also fortunate to work with other experts in the field, such as Dr. Krista Gehring, who is here with us today. The center conducts a number of activities in service of its mission. For instance, we provide presentations and trainings at national conferences. So I would encourage you to look for us if you are attending the upcoming conferences, APPA, NAPSA, or ICCA. We also have limited funds available to provide training and technical assistance to the field. For example, we have provided trainings on trauma-informed practice, training on gender-responsive risk and needs tools, and have provided assistance with strategic planning and program assessment. The Research Center also develops documents such as policy briefs and tools and maintains a website to meet information needs of the field. I recommend that you take a look at a document we recently developed called The 10 Truths That Matter When Working with Justice-Involved Women. You can find on our website, and there are actually two versions. One's a short summary, and another one is a longer research brief that contains more details and full citations of relevant research findings. You might also want to check out our Q&A document that we developed in response to a webinar we conducted last July. And our website contains the latest news on women offenders, frequently asked questions, and we have a page, Innovators in Criminal Justice, where we highlight innovative programs and individuals who are successfully applying gender-informed strategies. There also serves as a referral source for information, research, and subject matter experts. One of the ways we achieve this is by maintaining a resources section of our website, which provides links to over 200 online resources in key topic areas in relation to justice-involved women. For instance, you might want to take a look at our resources in the areas of community entry, classification, assessment, case management, and so on. I also mentioned that in addition to partnering with the Resource Center, the National Institute of Corrections continues to deliver products and services to the field specific to women. If you're already familiar with them, please know that they do provide expertise in a number of areas, two of which most relevant to our discussion today being women offenders and working with families of offenders. The Institute provides short-term technical assistance and training for jurisdictions who wish to improve their responses to women offenders. For instance, currently the Institute is offering an e-course on workforce development and women offenders. Another source you may be interested in is the National Directory of Programs for Women, which NIC developed in partnership with the Women's Prison Association. This is an online tool where you can search for programs by geographic area. NIC also maintains an extensive online library of resources. All of this information can be accessed through their websites, which are listed on this slide. Finally, I just want to encourage you to visit the Research Center's website and also join our mailing list in order to receive ongoing information about activities. If you have any questions, please do contact me. I want to thank the National Reentry Resource Center and the Criminal Justice Mental Health Consensus Project for giving us this opportunity today. And I'm really happy to introduce you to Dr. Krista Gehring, who is our presenter. Dr. Gehring has extensive experience training correctional personnel on how to use gender-responsive risk needs assessment instrument that was collaboratively developed by the National Institute of Corrections and the University of Cincinnati. She completed her dissertation where she examined whether the needs of female and male pretrial defendants were different and if these needs were risk factors for pretrial failure. And she's going to talk a little bit more about her research today. So with that, I welcome Dr. Gehring, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar today. Today's presentation, let me just go over really quickly what these sections are going to be. These are the sections in the webinar that we're going to be focusing on today. And this is intended to be a brief overview, and hopefully it will spawn more interest so that we can conduct more intensive webinars in the future on topics that you all have indicated interest in and the desire to have more in-depth discussion about. Section 1, we're going to be talking about women in the criminal justice system. Section 2 will address the what works research in corrections. Section 3 will introduce the gender-responsive movement in corrections. Section 4 is going to briefly introduce to you research that's been conducted on women in the criminal justice system with a focus on the research that Dr. Van Voorhis and myself have been doing. And 5 will discuss implementations of these findings. And Section 6 will provide you with any additional resources and contact information if you wish to look into this subject matter further. So let's begin. The first I talk about is women in the criminal justice system. So for several decades, there's been a large increase of women coming into the criminal justice system. So understanding the dramatic growth in female incarceration rates and the where and why of the growth, we can be able to effectively manage women offenders. growth factors in incarceration rates differ for men and women. Violence have increased for men, while the major increase for women has been drug offenses. The majority of women inmates are incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. In 2004, nearly two-thirds of women incarcerated in state prisons were there for nonviolent offenses, but the majority of the crimes women commit are different from their male counterparts. In 2004, more than half, 53%, of male state prisoners were serving time for a violent offense, compared to around a third, 34%, of female prisoners. Females were likely than males to be serving time for property offenses and drug offenses. The crimes are more likely to be incarcerated for are drug and property offenses. So let's information about the women offender and her place within the correctional system. It's useful to compare women offenders with male offenders in order to see the difference in percentages of incarceration rates between these two populations. While make up a majority of the population under correctional supervision, the rates of female offenders under correctional supervision have increased at a greater rate than male offenders. This has led many to realize the importance of recognizing and understanding this increasing female population. Before the differences between men and women offenders, let's take a look at how many women make correctional population in the United States. In a few minutes, I'm going to throw a lot of statistics at you. Hopefully you'll realize what I'm trying to convey to you in giving you a lot of numbers. And most importantly, I hope your eyes don't glaze over and you tune this part out. This is evidence found by studying women offenders that supports the rest of this webinar. After this, there'll be very little, if any, statistics for you to absorb, so just bear with me for a little bit. In the 80s, the incarceration rate of females has outpaced the incarceration rate of males. Women now make up 17% of the total population under some sort of correctional supervision. In the recent decades, the number of women under correctional supervision has increased dramatically. In 1990, there were 600,000 women under correctional supervision. This means prisons and jails, probation, and parole in the United States. By 2001, that number had risen to more than 1 million. Between 1990 and 2000, the total number of women under some type of correctional supervision control increased 81%. For men, the increase was 45%. Women, or 85%, were on probation or community supervision. Institute growth reflects a similar but even more dramatic pattern. During these same years, the percent increase for women entering prison was 108%, while the increase for men was 77%. When we look at jail population, we see an 89% increase for jails compared to a 48% increase for men. By the end of 2006, the number of women under correctional justice supervision had reached over 1.3 million. Women entering into the criminal justice system. Are women committing more crimes? Are the crimes becoming more violent? Actually, overall, women have not become more violent as a group. The majority of women are arrested for larceny, theft, or drug-related offenses. To put in perspective, the number of women in state prisons for drug offenses rose by 888% from 1986 to 1996. In a span of a decade, 888%. That percentage blows me away every time I look at it. The dramatic increase of women entering the system is due to drug or property offenses. And the property offenses are committed to support drug habits. With increase in the tough on crime policies and mandatory minimum sentences, prison populations have surged. Additionally, reduced funding for community mental health care has also caused women who suffer from mental illness to enter into the criminal justice system, as opposed to receiving help from a mental health care provider. The idea here is that more women are not necessarily committing crimes, but instead the increase in incarceration rates for women is due to the war on drugs and the breakdown into the break of the mental health system. So think of it as sort of a whack-a-mole game. Those of you who have been to an arcade and you've seen those whack-a-mole games, in this type of game, the mole pops up out of a hole. And you hit the mole with a mallet, which pushes him back down underground. Then he immediately pops up someplace else, and you're there. And the game keeps progressing as you keep hitting the mole, and he keeps popping up someplace else. So this back to the incarceration rate for women. As you clear women out of mental health services or drug treatment, they pop up elsewhere, and it's the criminal justice system. What life circumstances that are unique to their gender? And research has shown that there are significant differences between female and male offenders, specifically regarding their personal histories and pathways to crime. So let's take a look at the profile of the typical female offender in the United States. About 21% of adults arrested are women. And on average, women entering into the criminal justice system are in their early 30s. She's likely been convicted of a drug-related crime, typically undereducated, unskilled, and generally lives in poverty. Prior to incarceration, she most likely experienced sporadic employment or unemployment. And over half of the women in prison and jails are women of color. Women are the primary caregivers of minor children. 65% of women in prison and 70% of women in jail are mothers to minor children. Female offenders are more likely to experience physical and or sexual abuse than male offenders, not only as a child but also into adulthood. Substance use is another issue for women offenders. On every type of drug use, women offenders in state prisons reported higher usage than their male counterparts. And research has shown that a vast majority of female inmates in state prisons have substance abuse problems. Studies have shown that women have poorer or worse health than men. This poor health is often due to poverty, nutrition, inadequate health care, and substance abuse. Men also have more medical problems and issues related to their reproductive systems than do men. Many women who enter into the criminal justice system have had prior contact with the mental health system. Compared to women in the general population, women in prison have more incidences of mental disorders. Women in state prisons have been identified as having a mental illness. And in prison tend to suffer from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance abuse. Now let's take at reasons why women commit crime. Crime theory simply asks, why do people commit crime? Some theories say that people commit crime because they choose to do so. Other theories say that people commit crime because they're poor. Most of the theories were created by studying male subjects. As we've seen, women are very different from men. So it follows logically that the causes and motivations behind their offending cannot be explained by using theories that predict male behavior. Criticized using male-centered theories to explain female criminal behavior. This is labeled the generalizability problem, and that you can't take a male-centered theory and generalize it to women. And some people say you can't just add in and stir. You have to have theories that are specific to female offending. So there are several theories that try to explain female offending or that are used to direct women's programs. These theories take into account the life experiences and circumstances women experience, how these situations may cause women to offend, and how to generate programs to better treat women. If we understand theories, we can better assess these offenders to discover these causes, and this will in turn make our interventions more effective because they'll target these causes. Keep in mind, however, that theories may not explain all types of behavior. You may find one theory applies to an offender you know, while the same theory cannot apply to another offender. So don't let this discourage you. Criminal justice policies and practices must be theoretically based in order to have any sort of direction. If they're not based in theory, anyone could make up anything they wished, and when institutions do this, these programs prove not to be so great. So theoretical perspective is known as pathways, the pathways theory. This perspective looks at the lives of women prior to incarceration. Gender differences between the lives of men and women shape their patterns of criminal behavior. Women enter the criminal justice system via different pathways than men. The differences have been documented to be contingent upon the woman's experience with violence, substance abuse, and trauma. And the most prevalent pathways to crime they experience are based on survival, typically of abuse and poverty, and substance abuse. The perspective has identified several key components that produce and maintain female criminality. Main components of the pathways perspective. First, histories of personal abuse. Studies of female offenders have shown a link between histories of physical and or sexual abuse and their delinquency, addiction, and criminality. Female offenders typically are involved in abusive families and battered relationships. Illness, as we said before, many women who enter into the criminal justice system have had prior contact with the mental health system. Many offenders suffer from mental illness. Compared to the general population, women in prison have more incidences of mental disorders. Again, with substance abuse here, the vast majority of women in state prisons have substance abuse problems. And then there are other issues the pathway perspective addresses, such as economic and social marginality. Many women live in poverty, and this economic and social marginality may cause them to engage in activities that are illegal that bring them into contact with the criminal justice system. There's also an issue of homelessness. Women are homeless for various reasons, and this homelessness may complicate the lives of women who are in the criminal justice system. And lastly, we have relationships. In studying male and female offenders, it's been discovered that relationships are much more important to female offenders, and criminal behavior may be a result of involvement with antisocial family members, peers, or significant others. Now, this will show you what pathways women might travel into the criminal justice system. The one at the top illustrates this connection. Both of them illustrate a connection between history of abuse, mental illness, substance abuse. So many who suffer from abuse, either as children or adults, may develop mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, PTSD. And these mental illnesses, if they're not treated by a professional, may cause women to self-medicate through drugs and alcohol. And this self-medication can lead to addiction and substance abuse, which in turn affects and leads to offending. And the bottom pathway, this has actually been discovered looking at girls in the criminal justice system who are experiencing physical and sexual abuse. Oftentimes, girls will run away from their home environments and where they're experiencing abuse. And running away, they will begin to engage in survival behavior when they're on the streets, such as prostitution, drug use. And obviously, those types of activities can bring them in contact with the criminal justice system. So the pathway helps us identify the specific circumstances and events in women's lives that incite criminal behavior. Let's move on to correction. The next section, we're going to talk about what works in corrections. So when correctional interventions are effective. This is what we mean when we ask the question, what works? What works, or evidence-based practice, also known as EBP, means that some evidence exists that the program or intervention is effective. This is obtained through empirical research, not anecdotes or stories or common sense or beliefs about effectiveness. So why is empirical research so important? Let's look outside of corrections, where we more commonly think about EBP. The medical field uses EBP. If you went to a doctor because you were sick, would you want her to prescribe medication that someone told her worked for them? Or have medication she thinks will work based on her gut instinct? Or would medication prescribed that empirical medical research has shown to work? I know I would. This translates into correctional practice. If you're going to offer an offender some sort of criminal intervention, it should be one that's grounded in research. So keep in mind that the goal of the program must be considered when we're considering whether it works or not. Generally, in the field of corrections, we're attempting to reduce reoffending, also known as recidivism. When we talk about EBP or what works, we're talking about what works to reduce recidivism. Treatment programs in corrections is to reduce the criminal behavior of the participants. So in this case, the outcome that we're concerned with is recidivism. Example of what we mean by reducing recidivism. There are two groups of offenders, the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group receives a treatment program or some other sort of intervention, and the comparison group does not. What are the results to see how recidivism is impacted? Studies that have been conducted to date have reported that if we rely on evidence-based practices, we reduce recidivism by 20 to 30%. So when we research evidence, we prefer not to look at just one study. With one study, it's possible that outside influences are having an effect on the results. The results are specific to that one particular study. So when we have numerous studies in different areas over different periods of time with different subjects giving us similar results, we're then able to place more faith in those results. This is why we put greater faith in meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is a research study that summarizes the findings of other studies. It's essentially a study of studies. These are conflicting information about research in the news. Today, drinking red wine is healthy for you, but can you think of when you heard that it wasn't good for you? We heard similar conflicting studies about eating eggs. Some studies said they were good for us, and other studies said that they weren't. This is why we need meta-analyses. At all the studies that we've done, what's general consensus? This is what we want to take away, and this is what meta-analyses gives us. The methods that we look at in correctional research are of institutional and post-conviction community programs, not trial. And we're looking at programs working with convicted offenders. So cross meta-analyses have given us the principles of effective intervention. Meta-analysis discovered some common threads regarding effective correctional interventions. These common threads, or more technically principles, have been labeled the principles of effective intervention. They're referred to as R&R, which stands for risk, needs, responsivity. So now I'm going to briefly touch upon what each of these principles mean. The risk principle proposed that we should identify high, medium, and low risk offenders based on their likelihood of recidivism, escape, or other misconduct. This is done using actuarial objective assessment tools. An example of assessment tools that can identify a client's risk: the level of service inventory revised and the North Point compass. Risk level is identified. She should be matched to interventions and supervision levels based on her risk levels. The rule holds that interventions should be focused on higher risk offenders. Specifically, intensive treatment should be focused on medium to high risk offenders. The reason this is twofold. First, medium high risk offenders are the individuals we should be most concerned about because they're the most likely to recidivate, escape, or engage in other misconduct. And second, these individuals have the most to work with on and to change. So keep in mind that high risk means high need. Research that focusing resources on lower risk offenders will not produce any positive results and really have negative results. The reason is that placing low risk offenders in intensive treatment or institutional placements may expose them to high risk offenders in which they can learn to be criminal. And these placements can also disrupt circumstances in their lives that actually are making them low risk in the first place, like pro-social relationships, employment, or school. The needs principle. Some characteristics are criminogenic, which means that they affect the likelihood of future criminality. A person having those characteristics is more likely to commit crimes than a person not having those characteristics. Other characteristics are non-criminogenic, meaning that they don't affect the likelihood of committing crime. The needs principle focuses on risk factors. These are related to future offending, and they would receive high priority as we match offenders to programs. Risk factors are those characteristics of an offender that affect the likelihood of recidivism. There are two types of risk factors: static factors and dynamic risk factors. Static characteristics or aspects of a person that can't change. They're no because they increase the likelihood of whether a person will engage in future offending, but we target these risk factors with interventions. For example, static risk factors are things like age, sex, prior convictions, and substance abuse history. It's important to recognize these things, but we can't program for them. That's important to focus on dynamic risk factors, which are also referred to as criminogenic needs. Dynamic risk factors are risk factors that can change. And an individual's likelihood of committing a crime, it's important to focus on these characteristics that affect the likelihood of committing crime that they're criminogenic, and changeable, meaning that they're dynamic. Their programs that reduce needs will also reduce criminal behavior. Examples of risk factors for offending behavior. Now, including criminal history, because static, the rest of the risk factors listed here are relatively dynamic and can be targeted with interventions. You have antisocial attitudes, values, and beliefs, associates, antisociality, or also known as low self-control. We also have employment, education, job skills, problems, and dysfunction family. Risk need factors were pinpointed through studying primarily male subjects, and then they're applied to both male and female offenders. These risk factors are classified as gender neutral because research has discovered that all of these risk factors are predictive of both male and female offending behavior. But suppose for a moment that these tools and research that has been looking at risk factors for criminal behavior had been created by studying women instead of men. Would it look the same as the gender-neutral assessment tools and the gender-neutral risk factors that we have here, or would there be different risk needs in such a tool? Some reasons latter that we had started with female subjects, assessment tools and risk factors might look a little different than how they look now. Gender-responsive scholars believe that institutional classification systems that are gender-neutral, that is, designed using male subjects, are useful for women offenders, if not completely invalid for this population. And we'll discuss this in more depth in the next section. The last talk to you about is the responsivity principle. The base assumption underlying the responsivity principle is that offenders are not all the same. One offender is placed into treatment or provided an intervention. There are still things that could potentially interfere with how she will respond to that treatment. So the responsivity principle addresses barriers to treatment. That is, if these characteristics are present, they may affect an offender's likelihood of success in a program. For example, let's say a woman on your caseload has 3 small children and no transportation. And unfortunately, she doesn't have access to transportation. She has no one to help her care for her children. She's enrolled in a substance abuse program that's across town with to help her help her children while she goes to treatment and no way of actually getting to the program. She's not going to succeed in the substance abuse program. She can't even make it there. How can she succeed? So this principle holds that in order to help a person succeed in treatment, any barriers to this success must be addressed and removed as well. Now to the gender responsive movement and the decisions regarding women in the criminal justice system. Previously, concepts that could be categorized as gender neutral. That's no particular attention was given to the person's gendered needs and life circumstances. Realistically, studies of male offenders generated everything that was presented earlier in the what work section. With the specific issues women encounter in their lives that relate to offending and their response to treatment, we've developed practices and interventions that are gender responsive. Gender responsive means acknowledging the realities of women's lives and how they may differ from men. This includes pathways, the path they travel to offending, as well as how relationships shape their lives. Gender responsive practices are theoretically based, that are social and cultural factors, as well as therapeutic interventions. These process issues like violence, abuse, family relationships, substance use, trauma, parenting, intimate relationships, poverty, and mental health. So in order to gender responsive policies, programs, and practices, some findings should be taken into account. In order for a system to be effective for women offenders, it must be structured differently from a system for men offenders. Practice must target women's pathways to criminality by providing effective interventions for the related issues of substance abuse, trauma, mental health, and economic marginality. Sanctions recognize the low risk women present to public safety based on the types of offenses women are most likely to commit. And when delivering sanctions and interventions, gender-responsive programs take into account the importance of relationships in women's lives, particularly with their children and their roles in the community. Barbara Owen and Stephanie Covington conducted a comprehensive study for the Institute of Corrections to determine what gender-responsive strategies for the criminal justice system should entail. They gathered information from many disciplines like psychology, substance abuse, mental health, violence, health, trauma, employment, and education. By examining these bodies of knowledge and doing extensive literature reviews, it was discovered that there were findings in other disciplines that were found to be significant regarding women in the criminal justice system. These significant findings, along with factors that have been discussed in feminist writings, have been presented as gender-responsive risk factors. These factors are added to the factors already presented in the gender-neutral literature and assessments. These responsive risk need factors are issues that appear to be important in the lives of women, and if targeted, would reduce their chance of recidivism. The gender-responsive risk needs factors that are believed to be important for women in the criminal justice system. First one is relationship dysfunction. Earlier we talked about the importance of relationships in the lives of women, so it would make sense that any sort of positive or negative impact on the relationships of women would affect their likelihood of recidivism. Relationship dysfunction focuses on relationships with significant others, a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend, and involves whether a woman feels a lack of support and satisfaction in her relationship with the significant other. A support relationship is a relationship someone finds satisfying and that brings happiness to both partners. A supportive partner would encourage the woman to participate in programs that would help her avoid getting into trouble. However, since relationships are so important to women, they get lost in their relationship to the point that they neglect other relationships and responsibilities. Some women may get involved or even seek out relationships that are painful to them. Dysfunction in a woman's relationship could lead to physical abuse. In many cases, women have engaged in criminal activity because of the influence of a significant other. Particularly significant other is male. Relation can take on many forms. There may be frequent arguments and fights, or a significant other may try to control the woman and her life. The woman may do everything she can to tease this controlling partner, including making bad decisions or even breaking the law. She thinks this may help her situation. A other's involvement with the law can also cause conflict. The next is family conflict. Family conflict focuses on the relationships with a woman's family of origin, meaning her mother, father, siblings, immediate family. Family conflict is similar to relationship dysfunction, but it focuses on the family of origin rather than a significant other. Adult victimization. Female offenders have more extensive histories of abuse and adult victimizations than male offenders and women in the general population. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than 40% of the women in prison reported having been abused at time in their lives, compared to 9% of male offenders. Compared to those without a history of childhood abuse, adults with a history of childhood abuse are more likely to have a partner with a substance abuse problem, to experience anxiety disorders, eating disorders, depression, obesity, insomnia, panic, sexual dysfunction, substance abuse, suicidal ideation or behavior, and a multitude of other problems. Abuse is the main point for the pathways perspective, which says childhood trauma can lead to mental illness, substance abuse, and later criminal behavior. In both women and men, childhood abuse is linked to delinquency and adult criminal behavior. Research has also shown that childhood abuse may be a risk factor for continued victimization as an adult. While many experience abuse as a child, often they experience this abuse as adults. Women, on the other hand, represent a majority of victims of domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, and stalking. Women are likely to be victimized by an intimate friend or acquaintance. Mental or psychological abuse, such as humiliation, threats, and ridicule by someone close to them, may also occur. These victimizations, either as a child or adult, can lead to dysfunctional adaptations, behaviors, or experiences. They may experience nightmares or thoughts about the victimization when they don't want to think about it. They may avoid situations that remind them of the abuse, constantly guard, be easily startled, or feel numb or detached from others' activities or their surroundings. 2 risk factors that I want to talk about are parental involvement and parental stress. In our society, women tend to be the primary caregivers for minor children. Because of this, parental involvement and parental stress will have a significant impact on women more so than their male counterparts. It's important to assess women's parental involvement if she has minor children. This is crucial in helping her maintain this important relationship with her children. This is whether or not she has shared or full custody of her children, if her children have monthly contact with her, and if she's involved in decisions regarding her children. It also involves gauging her personal feelings about how prepared she feels to be a good parent. Parental stress can increase when a woman does not have adequate support or help with her minor children. If she's a single parent, does not have support from the father of her children, or help from family or friends in dealing with her children, her stress level may increase. One or more children with behavioral problems will also increase stress levels. This stress can lead to feelings of desperation and the desire to run away from it all. This could manifest itself in difficulties in maintaining custody of the children, or worse, child abuse and or neglect. Is a risk factor. When a study was found that many women did not feel safe where they lived. This because they lived with an abusive significant other, there was violence in the homes, or substance abuse was in the home. Also, this looks at whether her current housing is stable and can count on being able to live there in the foreseeable future. Most times also indicates issues that could point to criminal involvement or victimization, such as inability to pay rent or escaping an abusive partner. And finally, we look at symptoms of depression and anxiety and symptoms of psychosis. Research has shown that women offenders suffer more mental illnesses than men offenders. Compared to women in the general population, women in prison have more incidences of mental disorders. 1 of women in state prisons have been identified as having a mental illness. Left at these mental illnesses may lead to substance abuse and or criminal involvement. There are also a series of strengths that can act as protective factors for women. They're not listed on this slide, but I'm just going to tell you these can include educational strengths, family support, and self-efficacy. And we'll talk more about those strengths here pretty soon. Now, let's move to research on women in the criminal justice system. And much research was conducted using gender-responsive risk needs assessment. So primarily when we talk about this, let's start with the gender-neutral risk needs assessment and women offenders. While the gender-neutral assessments like the LSIR and the North Point Compass were designed for men and applied to women, with little concern for their appropriateness, we found that the original gender-neutral assessments were vetted for women. That means that they were predicting what they were supposed to predict. So these gender-neutral assessments, it's okay to use them with women offenders. However, professionals working with women in the criminal justice system and gender-responsive scholars as well felt that these assessments were not tapping into needs that were pertinent for women. Therefore, the existing risk needs assessments don't help us understand these women as best we could. Research has found that these gender-neutral assessments could be improved with the addition of a number of gender-responsive factors that were found to be predictive of incidental misconduct and community recidivism. In other words, we found that we could do better. We could improve how well we understand and treat these women. So, as a collaboration project between the National Institute of Corrections and the University of Cincinnati, a gender-responsive risk needs assessment was developed for convicted women offenders in the criminal justice system. This assessment was intended to evaluate gender-responsive needs such as child abuse, adult victimization, trauma, loss of personal power in relationships, safety, anger and hostility, family support, relationship support, parental stress, family conflict, and current symptoms of depression and psychosis. Accuracy of Cincinnati researchers took suggestions from staff and inmates. Research was conducted in 4 states, including 4 institutional, 4 probation, and 1 pre-release samples. And states were Colorado, Missouri, Minnesota, and Hawaii. A variant of the, I'm referred to it as the WRNA. It's the Women's Risk Needs Assessment, but from here on out, I'm going to say the WRNA so that I don't have to say that phrase over again. So a variation of the WRNA was also used by myself to conduct research at the trial phase to discover whether the needs of male and female pretrial defendants were related to pretrial failure, meaning failure to appear as a new arrest, and these needs varied by gender. Let's take a look at what this risk needs assessment looks like, the gender responsive. The initial instruction validation sites found that per WRNA that roughly looks like this. This is to conduct research about women in the criminal justice system. The items in blue are gender-neutral items found to be found in the most current risk needs assessment instruments. We have history, criminal thinking, meaning the antisocial attitudes, values, and beliefs, antisocial associates, vocational educational issues, financial problems, low family support, housing problems, and substance abuse. Those are gender-neutral items. But the gender-responsive factors were important too. Thus, the new gender-responsive assessments will be paying attention to mental history, anxiety symptoms, psychosis symptoms, child abuse, adultization, relationship dysfunction, parental stress, and housing safety. And let me just explain to you concerning the reason that institutions is in parentheses next to child abuse means that in the research it was discovered that child abuse was only predictive of prison misconducts. It wasn't predictive of community recidivism. There was something sort of intrinsic in the environment of the prison that was sort of bringing this child abuse risk factor. And if you look at parental stress and housing safety, obviously those are going to be important in community samples because when you're in prison, you have your children there to have that sort of parental stress, and the housing safety that I talked about concerning that risk factor, what it looked like, really sort of applies to what's going on in the community. So it makes no sense to look at strengths such as self-efficacy, parental involvement, family support, and educational assets. Let the slide scare you. This slide, I know I was going to talk to you about statistics, but I have to show you this. For those of you who are not statistic gurus, don't worry. This isn't going to be difficult. All I'm going to give you is the evidence behind this assessment, the research that was conducted with it. That's showing you that using the gender-responsive assessments is continuing with the early foundation of using evidence-based practice. So essentially, this is research visually represented. So what you see here is risk scales is related to recidivism for each of the study samples. The easiest way to look at this is that for the R values, you can see R right there in the column, the bigger number, the better. And the more stars next to it, the better. And for the AUC numbers, we want them to be as close to 0.70 as possible. So let's look at the risk scales. The first row is the group of static risk factors. Remember, these are items from a woman's past that she can't go back and change, like criminal history or prior escapes, etc. You can see for all 3 groups, the prison, probation, and pre-release, we've got lots of stars. So the static models alone predicted recidivism with the female offenders. Now the next row down, the gender-neutral risk needs assessment. Remember, this is like your LSR type of assessment that contains static and dynamic risk factors. So factors that criminal history and prior escapes, as well as risk factors she can change, like current substance abuse and attitudes. What you see here is that, and we have more stars. So the dynamic gender-neutral risk needs assessments predict recidivism better than the static models. Now look at the addition of the gender-responsive risk factors to the gender-neutral risk needs assessment. the next one down in row 3. Numbers got bigger. This means adding the gender-responsive risk factors to the gender-neutral risk factors, we got better at predicting recidivism and prison misconducts. And what's so interesting is that when we only looked at the gender-responsive risk factors without including the gender-neutral risk factors, in almost every sample we did just as well, if not better, at predicting recidivism than the gender-neutral risk needs assessment. So there's certainly evidence supporting the addition of the gender-responsive risk factors to our current practices of risk assessment. This because I thought that you might find this interesting. These are the results really represented as to what is important for which type of criminal justice setting. Because what was found is that not all risk factors were important for every single correctional environment. So in this particular slide, we see these items predict misconducts in institutions. The needs don't predict in institutions, but will upon release, so we need to program for those. And essentially this just means that environment pulls. Who adjusts worse to prison? The women with the most problems do worse. So here in prison, we have gender-neutral factors of criminal history, antisocial attitudes, family conflict, and substance abuse. Then we also have gender-responsive risk factors, family conflict, mental health history, depression and psychosis symptoms, anger, relationship dysfunction, and child abuse. And it's important, too, these strengths, the strength that if a woman has more of these things, if they have more family support or they have more self-efficacy, they were less likely to engage in institutional misconducts. And then things that likely to program for, employment, education, poverty, housing safety, adult victimization, because those are going to be issues for women when they go out into the community. The next slide we're going to look at, these facts predict for women in pre-release environments. So those who are being released from an institutional setting onto parole. So how different from institutional factors? Well, we see that antisocial friends, financial employment, education, and substance abuse that are gender-neutral items become important for this group. We gender-responsive factors such as parental stress, parental involvement, adult victimization, and housing safety all influence recidivism for this group, which makes sense because now they're in the community. Lastly, we also see that child abuse and antisocial attitudes are no longer important. So again, environment pulls. And have more strengths here. We also have educational assets and parental involvement, which is important for the women in the community. Oh, and I can note the risk factors that are in italics, like the housing safety, the family conflict, those have been shown in some samples to be important and other samples not to be as important. So we just need to conduct more research on those particular risk factors. So that's why those are in italics. Let's take a look at the environments. Now looking at individuals who are on probation, on parole. And we see that in terms of the gender-neutral factors, antisocial attitudes returns to predict recidivism. And for the gender-responsive factors, parental involvement no longer appears significant. So again, it's not this one-size-fits-all concerning risk factors, whether they're gender-neutral or gender-responsive. We need to be cognizant of the environment that the person is in because those risk factors are really going to bind upon which type of criminal justice setting that person is in. All right, let's talk about research in the pretrial realm. This is I conducted fairly recently I actually looked at male and female pretrial defendants in Hamilton County. And to date, little research has been conducted at the pretrial phase, and this is due to many constraints at this phase of the criminal justice system. However, I was fortunate enough to gain access to pretrial defendants in Hamilton County, Ohio, when I was doing research for my dissertation. When Dr. Van Voris was developing the WERNA, initial discussions about the instrument included developing a pretrial instrument. While a pretrial instrument was developed with the aid of the pretrial personnel at the Hamilton County, Ohio Department of Pretrial Services and staff at the court clinic, and UC weren't able to conduct construction validation studies at the intended sites. They were going to do construction validation studies in Boulder, Colorado, Maricopa County, Arizona, and Hamilton County, Ohio. So the project shifted focus to assessments for community and institutional settings, and the pretrial component was not funded. In April 2007, the Hamilton County, Ohio Department of Pretrial Services began to use the assessment instrument to aid with program referrals. In addition to the items created by NIC and UC, the pretrial staff modified the instrument by adding a few other items that were important in generating a more accurate picture of the clients that they serve. Not only did they use the instrument for women defendants, the initial intended population, they also administered it to men. The Hamilton County Pretrial Agency coined the name Inventory of Need Pretrial Screening Tool for the instrument, and that name implies the county used the instrument to focus on needs rather than risk. Currently, the pretrial agency uses the instrument for assistance in various aspects of case processing. This includes using the nation as a screening tool for case management of diversion clients, release planning for individuals who cannot afford bail, determination of supervision requirements for individuals released on own recognizance bonds, triaging defendants to the court clinic who are experiencing significant and immediate mental health issues. The information on the tool, however, is not handed over to judicial officers to aid them in their pretrial release decisions. Pretrial service staff recommend certain release conditions or assistance for the defendant based on the instrument, but court judicial officers are allowed access to the information collected by the screening tool. So essentially, as I use that screening tool, I collect a sample of male and female pretrial defendants. The tool is 266 individuals. Main research questions for the research were these needs related to pretrial failure, and did the needs differ for men and women, both in prevalence and predictive power? Effort was made into generating the needs, also known as scales, in the studies. And the process is crazy to involve, free to go into here, but if you're interested in the scale construction, you actually contact me for more information, and I will be glad to tell you how I constructed these scales for the study. With that said, let's take a look at the pretrial needs examined in this research. The neutral scales included in the study were criminal history, which was a scale comprised of static factors to indicate risk, and educational need, and substance abuse. And the responsive scales were abuse, trauma, mental health, homelessness, and family support, which essentially was a strength that I wanted to look at. Now, the reason some of these scales are in different colors is that during scale construction, some scales were the same for men and women, meaning that they had the same items, the same questions, all were brought together to create a scale, and that was for criminal history, employment, trauma, and homelessness. Some varied for men and women, meaning that different items were included in the scale for men and the scale for women, which were the green scales that I have up here. And scales were only used for one gender and not the other. And the reason for this is that items in that domain were not predictive for a particular gender, so a scale wasn't made for them. For example, none of the education items in the inventory of need were predictive of women's outcomes, so a scale wasn't made for them. The education scale is in blue because it was only created for men. Conversely, no abuse items were predictive for men, so that's why the abuse scale is in pink, because it was only created for women. I know, I use stereotypical colors for this, but it's easier to explain. So let's take a look at what the results are here. And the visual representation as to what scales were important for male outcomes, meaning failure to appears, new arrests, and any failures, which was a combination of failure to appears and new arrests. The gender scales of criminal history and substance abuse predicted FTAs, while the gender responsive scales of trauma, mental health, homelessness, and family support were also related to this outcome. All gender neutral scales created in this research, which were related to men's, all of the neutral scales created in this research were related to men's arrests. However, that none gender responsive scales were related to this outcome for men. And when any failures, all of the scales created for men, both gender neutral and gender responsive, were related to this outcome. So important to see on this is that new that's predicting for men was the gender neutral risk factors, not gender responsive risk factors. Take women, the needs that are related to women's pretrial failures. Note that unlike the men's results, we have and abuse are related to FTAs. Abuse was related to all of women's outcomes, which was something that I found really interesting, and I was kind of glad to see. Also, the gender responsive scales are now predicting new arrests. We have abuse, mental health, and homelessness are important predictors for new arrests for women. So these results indicate that the gender responsive scales were important in sort of comprehensively predicting women's outcomes. Just the gender scales were good predictors of all outcomes for men and women. However, the gender responsive scales were also important in the prediction of FTAs and any failures for everyone and all the outcomes for women. I think it's also important to consider our scales that were important in prediction. Not only were the standard criminal history and substance abuse important, but also scales that tapped into mental health and abuse. So more will be conducted in this area, and I'm currently looking into expanding this research so that I can increase the sample size and a more diverse population. But if you have any additional questions regarding this research, don't hesitate to contact me. So now, which is emerging, what can we do? Well, essentially, there are three sort of big things that we can do. First, we can start adopting gender-responsive assessment tools in order to get a better picture of the criminal justice system, to tap into their needs, to really sort of identify them more comprehensively than by using the gender-neutral assessment tools. Now, I'm not saying to abandon the gender-neutral assessment tools, but I think it would probably be good practice to, add gender-responsive risk factors if you're wanting to fully and comprehensively deal with these women in the criminal justice system. And if you use gender-responsive assessment tools, you can also implement these comprehensive case planning approaches. Case planning, case management, having these, round services that really sort of acknowledge all of the intertwining and interconnected issues that women have that can be identified by the assessment tools. And lastly, develop and use gender-responsive programming that targets the needs of women. We've identified the risk factors. We're doing case management for them. Now we need to have programs that actually are targeting these risk factors and these needs so that it will, reduce the likelihood that these women will come back to the criminal justice system. Of gender-responsive interventions. I don't know if any of you are familiar with any of these, but gender-responsive programming is one of the newest developments in evidence-based programming. And here's a list of some of the gender-responsive interventions available for use with female offenders. We have trauma that Stephanie Covington created. It's a 3-module cognitive behavioral therapy for women, which focuses on helping women understand, identify, and heal from trauma experience such as childhood abuse, rape, battering, and other forms of interpersonal violence. Female offender treatment and employment programs. Grenwell actually does these. California's residential program designed to assist in the successful reintegration of women parolees into the community through intensive employment, substance abuse, criminal involvement, and parenting case management services. There's Forever Free. It's a model community for incarcerated women, stress of substance use treatment, and relapse prevention. Women Recover is another thing that Stephanie Covington has done. It's a cognitive behavioral program designed to treat women who are recovering from substance abuse, psychological trauma, and correctional settings. La Familia is a model designed to reduce the recidivism of substance abusing offenders by strengthening their social support networks through case management. This program was not designed specifically for female offenders. It incorporates many of the gender-responsive principles in its techniques. Moving on, was developed at Eaton. It's a gender-responsive cognitive behavioral therapy designed to build on existing strengths and to enhance personal and community resources available to the offender. Seeking Safety was created by NATS. It's a present-focused program designed to help substance-abusing female offenders who also suffer from PTSD to attain safety and come to terms with substance abuse. And then finally, we have the Women Offender Case Management Model. This is a four-stage model designed to develop social capital by building upon strengths and developing a system of supportive resources. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me. I really enjoyed speaking to you all, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.
Gehring and Rachelle. Before we start the question and answer session, there are a few resources that we would like to share with everybody. First, the National Reentry Resource Center, which is now in its third year, was established by the Second Chance Act to provide education, training, and technical assistance to states, tribes, territories, local governments, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and corrections institutions working on prison reentry. The center is administered by the Council of State Governments, who's presenting this webinar today, in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Department of Justice. This is a snapshot of the Resource Center's homepage. We're constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events like the webinar that you're hearing today, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the website that's listed on your screen, nationalreentryresourcecenter.org, and follow the link in the upper left-hand corner where it asks for your name and your email address. To the National Reentry Resource Center, we also run the Criminal Justice and Mental Health Consensus Project, which is coordinated by the Council of State Governments Justice Center. It's an unprecedented national effort to help state and federal policymakers and criminal justice and mental health professionals improve the response to people with mental illnesses who come into contact with the criminal justice system. Since the publication of the landmark Consensus Project report in 2002, written by Justice Center staff and representatives of leading criminal justice staff working on the Consensus Project, we have supported the implementation of practical, flexible criminal justice mental health strategies through on-site technical assistance, the dissemination of information about programs, research, and policy developments in the field, continued development of policy recommendations and educational presentations. In with the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, we have created 11 national learning sites, 5 of which are mental health court sites and 6 of which are law enforcement jurisdictions. Also, one of the largest interactive and fully searchable online databases of collaborative criminal justice and mental health programs across the country, as well as a number of specialized publications on courts, corrections, law enforcement, and other mental health topics. You can find our website at consensusproject.org, and similar to our National Reentry Resource Center website, we also do have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for at the top of our page. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Federal Interagency Reentry Council, that work that is being done by the Women in Reentry subgroup of the Federal Interagency Council. It's a collaborative effort convened by Attorney General Holder to enhance reentry efforts across the federal government. As you learned, will make up a relatively small percentage of the offender population. They have a set of unique characteristics and needs which must be addressed in order to facilitate successful reentry. For example, unlike men, women are more likely to be the primary caregiver to their children prior to incarceration. Women are more likely to have a history of trauma, including physical and or sexual abuse, and women are more likely to have severe substance abuse and mental health issues. However, because of the relatively small number, the special needs of women offenders are often not addressed by the criminal justice and human service systems. The purpose of the subgroup is to mobilize federal systems to more effectively address the needs of women offenders and to improve outcomes for these women. For example, efforts the group may recommend might be increased support for women to reconnect and reunify with their children, use of trauma-informed treatment models for women, and or broader implementation of gender-responsive substance abuse and mental health interventions for women. Building on the information exchanged at the March conference, Meeting the Reentry Needs of Women, Policies, Programs, and Practices, sponsored by the Office of Women's Health within the Department of Health and Human Services. The subgroup was initiated as a part of the Reentry Council Working Group's activities. It comprised of federal staff committed to improving outcomes for reentering justice-involved women. The subgroup is working on a 2013 action plan strategy through 5 coordinated task groups, each of which addresses a different topic: policy and legal review, research synthesis and agenda, communications network, cross-training needs and opportunities, and inventory of programs. Each of the groups is designed a proposed roadmap of activities specific to the designated topics noted above to be considered by the Reentry Council for implementation in 2013. For further information on this initiative, feel free to contact Linda Melgren or Claire DiSalvo, whose email addresses are listed on this slide. Linda and Claire, with the help of the task group members, are moving this work forward and would be happy to answer any questions. The other websites that we've mentioned as well, the National Reentry Resource Center, the Consensus Project, as well as the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women, their websites are all listed on this slide as well. If you have not already done so and you have some questions, we encourage you to now please type your questions into the bottom right-hand corner of your Q&A box. We've gotten an enormous number of questions that have come in, so we're going to try and get through as many as we possibly can. Give me one second. What I will be doing is typing into the chat box in the center of the screen the question that we are currently on. So, Dr. Gehring, some of these go kind of over a whole bunch of different topics. So I've started to group them together a little bit, and we'll start at the beginning. First question is, for an Indian tribe, are there studies, empirical research about culturally based treatments, approaches in working with Native women offenders?
You know, I actually saw that question. I was thinking about it, and unfortunately, I am aware of anything that has been done concerning that. And the reason for that, I really think that a lot of research of women in the criminal justice system is really sort of in its infancy. So just reaching women in general is something that has only just begun. So to have any sort of designation or specificity or focusing on a particular type of racial or ethnic group of women really, to my knowledge, hasn't been done at this point. Does it? It's not going to occur, but unfortunately, I don't have any sort of information regarding that. But that's something that actually I'm going to write down and look into. So my answer is no, not that I'm aware of, but I would think that eventually that's going to, then in the future.
Ben for a second and say that that on your screen right now is going to direct you to a section on the Consensus Project website that is a forum where questions that we don't get to can be answered. And some of the questions that we have some follow-up information for, a number of people who have asked for specific research, quantitative and qualitative research. We will put some of those links on that forum in the next few days or so, about in the next week. But specifically for work with Native women offenders, that is some work that the Center, both on the Consensus Project side and the National Reentry Resource Center side, both do. And there are a number of consultants that we usually work with around the country that are looking at how to implement different evidence-based practices and pay attention to the sensitivity of Native women offenders. So when we post that question, I will list a couple of different other websites and other places that provide technical assistance in that area. Okay, another question. With dwindling resources, our county's limited resources are being directed at violent offenders. This is a hard question. We know this usually isn't the female caseloads. Keep female caseloads relevant when most of their crimes are property and drug crimes.
An ongoing issue of, we always about how we're like the invisible offender because they're not violent, because they're not posing a threat to public safety as much as male offenders. So they tend to get overlooked because, oh, they're not that serious, or they're only engaged in nonviolent crimes. And there has to be some sort of agency investment in helping these women and in keeping that, population at the forefront. I mean, I don't necessarily know what to tell you to do concerning, how you can get everybody on board in that particular agency, only that, crime is crime, and crime affects everyone, whether it's violent or whether it's nonviolent. It affects public safety. There are victims, whether the crimes are violent or nonviolent. So to make violent crimes more important in that particular agency and not directing any sort of attention to women offenders because they're not that serious is really sort of detrimental, all I say is that, we're talking about people, talking about, not only lives of women, but also the rest of us who are being victimized by those particular crimes. I don't think you can really place an emphasis or importance on, well, this one's more important than the other. It's unfortunate that that's what's happening in your agency. I guess, everybody just has to get on board concerning, that crime is important, that all crime has victims, and that, just because it's not serious doesn't mean that it's not something that shouldn't be, or, addressed. And that's the question to answer. And that's the best I got,
I would say, I preface it by saying it was a hard question.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would encourage people to do, actually, some of the questions that we ask are, fall into that category of our presenters are really excellent at what they do, but don't necessarily have the answers to everything. On the forum where we're going to be posting our questions, anybody who's on today's webinar can actually respond to any of those questions. It's like a bulletin board where you can have a conversation back and forth. So I would encourage anybody who's running a program that's out in the real world right now that is experiencing something that's similar to that issue to go ahead and please respond to that question to help out some of your peers around the country.
I actually saw a question in looking at these things. Do you mind if I address the question that I saw?
Go ahead.
So that's a question about that they're already using the LSIR, assessing their crisis population. They're using the LSIR, I'm assuming, to assess women, and they wanted to know if there was something that could be used with the LSIR, and there actually is. If you have an agency that's already using a gender-neutral risk needs assessment like the LSIR or something else, Dr. Van Voort has come up with what she calls trailer. There are two versions of the WRNA. There's the standalone it's a complete interview, and you can use that all by yourself, or there's a trailer that's intended to hook on to the SIR. So the trailer it doesn't have the gender neutral risk factors in it. It has just the gender responsive risk factors. So you get access to that to use with the SIR in your agency if you're interested in doing that. And to get information about that, you can go to the website that's listed, the www.uc.edu/women offenders. That has all the information about it. So I just wanted to address that because that was one of the things that I saw.
Okay. There's another question that I had posted right before that one, similar to this one, but I think more conceptually about the LSIR in general. We use the LSIR as our primary assessment instrument. Do you know if this or any other ABP assessment instrument can help ID the female client's pathway to criminality? Is it primarily the prioritization of dynamic risk factors?
Well, like I said, the WRNA can be used. And the WRNA, all the risk factors that I had up there, like mental health, parental stress, parental involvement, abuse, relationship dysfunction, all of those risk factors that I had are included in the WRNA. So WRNA taps into those risk factors that give you a better picture of the woman, and that can also better connect her to services that can address those gender-responsive risk factors.
Here's a couple of easy questions. Dia wants to know if they can get a copy of the Warner. Is it available for general use? And have you also used it in a post-prison or specifically for offenders?
The Warner is actually, it's public domain. And what happens is if agency is interested in using the WARNA, you need to contact Ashley Bauman and talk to her about it. And what happens, you go through a series of steps. Unlike LSIR, you don't have to pay for it. The LSIR, I think you have to pay for every single piece of paper you're using. I don't know. But the WARNA is public domain, so it's quote-unquote free. However, you need to be trained on how to use it. So, Ashley and I may even come and train you. If you're wanting that, you have to be trained on how to do the assessment. There are also other aspects of the trainings like motivational interviewing and case planning and all those sorts of things. And there are different versions of the WARNA. There's an institution with WARNA that is used in prisons. There's a community WARNA, which is used for parole, I believe, and there's a pre-release WARNA that's used for sort of reentry purposes, those sorts of things. There are 3 versions of it with all the respective risk factors that are relevant for that particular environment. So, that's available. All you have to do is just, click a link or go call Ashley or whatever and talk to her about it. And she can definitely, because she's a business manager of all of that sort of stuff, so she'll have all the information concerning the warrant if that's what you are interested in for your agency.
I'm going to be skipping around a little bit, but I think that this is a good question that's come up for a bunch of different people already. While the ideal is obviously to develop a fully women-centered program, what would you recommend is the first thing to change for a program that currently uses only gender-neutral ABPs?
So, like what to modify a gender-neutral program? Is that what the question's asking?
I do not
modify it to make it more gender responsive.
I'm gonna sort of jump in and speak a little bit about what I've found with a lot of the grantees that I work with. They use things that are generally gender neutral or lean a little bit towards an EBP that might look at women or maybe some trauma things, but a lot of information that you've presented, and they have very, very limited resources of how to implement anything. So if they're going to do one best thing first, what's the direction that you would go in? There's a resource capacity issue here, I think, across the board.
The best thing first, I mean, if you're going to, if you want a program that's going to be effective, whether it has gender-neutral components or gender-responsive components, it needs to be a cognitive behavioral program. Those types of research or those types of treatment modalities have been shown to be the most effective in reducing recidivism because targeting criminal thinking. So concerning EBP, whether it's men or women or whatever, get them in some sort of cognitive behavioral program. That's my recommendation. I'm a total advocate for it. That's evidence-based practice. Behavioral program is the way to go. If you had a neutral program and wanted to sort of modify it to make it more gender responsive, I don't target some of the, risk factors, or if the gender neutral program actually does target risk factors, make those factors more gender in a gendered context of how they're more relevant for women. Because, I can sit up here and tell you that, women are unemployed and women live in poverty and women have substance abuse. And people are probably thinking, well, men have those issues too, which I would agree. However, it's all context. Women experience poverty differently. Women experience unemployment differently. Women engaging in substance abuse for different reasons than men. So, let's say is number one, cognitive programs. Number two, make sure that you modify any sort of programs that you have that are more in line with the risk factors that I've talked about, to make them a little more relevant. participant. Just answer the question.
Yeah, it does a good job. Another hard question for you.
Oh God. Okay.
Okay, it's more of a general question, but I'm curious. This is a question that comes up a lot for my programs.
Okay.
We're using evidence-based practice at our facility, and I found myself testing motivational interviewing with my family members. The question is, how do we continue to encourage and motivate my coworkers to use evidence-based practices?
Oh, use motivational interviewing. I love motivational interviewing. Mike, why wouldn't the coworkers want to be using evidence-based practices?
We don't have that dialogue, but I can jump in and say that changing, speak for the programs around the country, changing practices that case management and supervision folks do is sometimes a really, really difficult perspective climb. It's kind of like a high lift for them. And they might not be familiar with those different interventions, or they might be doing something one way and they've been doing it for a long time. Or I'm going to also guess they haven't been sensitive to women's needs before.
Right. Well, and it may also be that this is causing them more work. I mean, that's something I also hear too when I do training. It's like, we don't want to do this because this is making us do work, and we already have, piles of papers to do and all this sort of stuff. And, the bottom line is if you do something that research is showing is correct, that it's effective, that, it's actually, it's the right thing to do. It may be difficult to learn in the beginning, and it may go against what you've always done, and you may think that what you're doing is the right way, the highway, or whatever. Bottom line is, what you do is target things at the beginning, do things the right way at the beginning, and it may take a longer time to do it, to do this case plan, or to do motivational interviewing, or to do this gender responsive assessment. But the time, effort that in the beginning may affect the later stages of this woman's life, and it may actually affect the fact that you don't see her again. Do you know? So it's like all of these things that are going on in the beginning, using evidence-based practices, new practices that are going on. We're not just doing it because we want to make everybody's lives difficult. Research has shown that this works. And it would happen in the medical field. All of a sudden, people are like, oh, this drug works. We need to prescribe it to everybody. Or this surgical procedure works. We need to start doing it. I don't think doctors are going to be like, you know what, I like this old drug. Or, I just this old surgery. I don't want to use the new instruments. I don't want to do the new procedure. Can you imagine if that happened in the medical field? But so it shouldn't be happening in the criminal justice field either. Unfortunately, it does. And to motivate people to sort of get on this bandwagon and do evidence-based practice and all this stuff, eventually, I think if you frame it, if you put it in a framework of it's going to benefit them as well. It's not just all this extra work. It's not just going against their mentality, whatever. It's going to benefit them. If they sort of things that research says works, then it's going to work. You're not going to be seeing the same people over and over again, and they're not going to be having the same headaches or whatever. So I think sort of frame it in that it's going to benefit everyone is something I think could be used as well. That's a good answer. Great, because I don't even know what I said. So.
It is now 3:31, and we are just over time. Actually, we had close to 50 questions that have come in for this webinar, and they still keep coming in, so I wanted to direct everybody once again. And about next week sometime, you will get a link to both the point slides, this webinar, as well as a link to our Consensus Project forum where we'll be posting these questions. And over the next weeks or so, we will have have Dr. Gehring as well as some of her colleagues and some of our staff be able to answer some of those questions as well. And if there are any other questions that you have had that we haven't gotten to, we encourage you to post them to the forum. And also, from your own experience, to please comment on any questions that you see that are relevant to the work that you are doing as well. This concludes our webinar on what works for women engaged in the criminal justice system. Thank you all for your attendance and participation. Thank you to the Bureau of Justice Assistance for sponsoring this event. And a very big thank you to our presenter, Dr. Krista Gehring, and to Rachelle Ramirez. A recording of the presentation will be available online early next week on our website, consensusproject.org. And finally, when you leave this event, a brief survey on this webinar will pop up on your screen, and we'd very much appreciate your feedback. Thank you again for your participation today.